de débat, the honourable member for Elmwood, Transcona.
Oh, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to rise in support of sending this bill on to committee at this time. One of the things I find really refreshing about this debate actually is that there's a certain amount of simplicity to this bill as compared to other types of trade measures that often come before the House. And it's not to say that the bill couldn't stand to be improved. I think my honourable colleague from Vancouver Kingsway just made some good suggestions as to how the committee might look into improving this bill. For those Canadians listening at home, the object of the bill is relatively simple. It allows two things in order to bring us into compliance with the TFA signed with the WTO, which is first of all to allow Health Canada to either send back or allow for the disposal of goods that come to Canada and don't meet certain health requirements. And it would also allow the transit of goods across the country that may not be in compliance with standards that they would have to meet in order to stay here, but could be moved from coast to coast and then on to another destination. I mean, these are the kinds of issues that it makes sense to talk about when we talk about trade and trying to reduce barriers and trade-offs. And that was part of the nature, I think, of the or what was driving that exchange initiated by the member from Vancouver Kingsway. What's refreshing about it is that we see the government initiating a trade measure that doesn't, at the same time, as we have seen so many times by Liberal and Conservative governments, sell out Canadian sovereignty in order to make life a little bit more convenient for foreign corporations, which is the kind of thing we're seeing again with CETA and TPP, Mr. Speaker. And so it is really nice and refreshing for New Democrat, because New Democrats do support trade and we support reasonable measures to promote trade, but not have to be having a debate about the nature of Canadian sovereignty and the ability of a democratically elected government in Canada to legislate to protect the environment and protect workers here. And that's very nice, Mr. Speaker. I wish we could do that more often in this place. So that's one of the reasons why, despite for some Canadians who may have been listening at home and find the debate kind of bland, I'm actually taking a certain delight in this debate, Mr. Speaker. We're not talking about a trade deal, for instance, that would lock Canada into extra patent protection for large pharmaceutical companies that already have a 20-year life on their patents and would raise the cost of pharmaceutical drugs here. One of the reasons the NDP has been advocating for a national pharmaceutical plan or a national pharmacare plan has been to reduce the cost of drugs. And we do hear from the new Liberal government that they want to reduce the cost of health care in ways that make more care more accessible to Canadians. But instead of pursuing a national pharmacare program, we've seen them lending support to deals like CETA and the TPP that are actually going to do more to increase the cost of drugs for Canadians than whatever they may do, short of signing a national pharmacare plan, to reduce those costs. And if it is the case that even if they did bring in a national pharmacare plan, and Mr. Speaker, I'll be very pleased but also very surprised if that ends up being something that comes to pass in the term of this government, to go around and then sign a deal like the TPP, or CETA for that matter, that with the other hand raises the cost of those drugs to nullify the benefit of such a plan, I put to you, Mr. Speaker, would be a Pyrrhic victory for this government. It's a lot of effort to bring in such a plan, and the effort is not well spent if it's just to backfill the pockets of pharmaceutical companies that are potentially perhaps going to receive less money under a pharmacare plan because the unit cost of drugs is going to go down. It's not then our obligation to go and sign a deal like the TPP just to put that money right back in their pockets. We're interested in the net gain for Canadian families, not for international pharma, Mr. Speaker. It's nice to talk about trade and not be talking about, for instance, Mr. Speaker, agreements that would, when we have agreement. I mean, we've heard the new Minister of Labour say that there's been a problem with the temporary foreign worker program, for instance, and that it's been abused, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to be able to talk about how do we reduce legitimate trade barriers without having to have a whole conversation about how are we going to create a shadow temporary foreign worker program that's hidden in an international trade deal with 12 other parties that can't be changed, when we know that even when the program was being administered only by the Canadian government, there were plenty of problems with that program, Mr. Speaker, and that we were fortunate that the government was able to act unilaterally to try and curb some of the worst abuses of that program, a program that was making life difficult for Canadian workers who are now competing with temporary foreign workers, but also making life hard for those temporary foreign workers who in many cases were being asked to pay obscene amounts of money in their home country just to get to a job that when they came to Canada was not what they were promised, but they had to put up with it. They had to put up with substandard wages, and they had to put up with substandard working conditions that were not part of the promise under threat of deportation by their employer. That's not what it means to talk about reducing legitimate trade barriers, and we shouldn't have to conflate all of those issues together, Mr. Speaker, and then be told that if we're opposed to enshrining a broken TFW program in an international trade deal that we're not in favor of trade, Mr. Speaker. And we shouldn't have to be told that if we have a meaningful plan and believe in having affordable pharmaceutical drugs for Canadians, that somehow we're anti-trade. Yeah. This is the kind of thing we should be talking about when we're talking about trade. Trade-offs. Some may be reasonable, some maybe not. And we may ultimately be in favor of some and some ultimately not. It'll be because we think that the trade-offs are on balance better for Canadians or on balance worse. But the practice of successive Liberal and Conservative governments of ramming through a whole bunch of bad public policy and taking away the right of democratically elected governments in Canada to change those policies when they don't work and calling that a debate about simple trade, Mr. Speaker, is a dishonesty that needs to come to an end. And at least we've been spared that dishonesty in this debate, and if nothing else, I'm glad for that, Mr. Speaker. Thank you very much.
Well said. Bravo. Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Guelph.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and through you to the Honourable Member from Elmwood, Transcona. I think of Elmwood, Transcona as a rail centre of Canada with Symington yards there and the CN yards. Trade obviously is a big part of the Honourable Member's constituency, and yet in 2014-2015, exports dropped by another 7% over the previous year. Even with the free trade deals and even with all the promotion of free trade, we weren't trading. So maybe the Honourable Member could comment on how this bill that we're now discussing might actually result in some trade and maybe get some trains moving through Transcona Elmwood, and whether there are any other hindrances to trade that free trade deals don't address that maybe we should be considering.
Member for Elmwood, Transcona.
Well, I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question and his knowledge of Elmwood, Transcona, and certainly as a Member of Parliament representing a rail community, there's two sides to the element in this bill that's about transporting dangerous goods from one corner of the country to the other. On the one hand, I'm optimistic and glad at the thought that it might help increase rail traffic because there's many people in my riding definitely that would benefit from that. On the other hand, we are also a community through which those very goods are going to be passing, and so it's important to me, and I would implore those on the committee to take seriously the warnings of the member from Vancouver Kingsway and to ensure that however that comes to pass, and I'm confident and hopeful that there is an appropriate way to do that it doesn't put people either working on the railway at risk or people in those communities. And I would just end by saying I think you're quite right that in spite of all the trade deals that have been signed, still we see that real wages have gone down, that untold tens of thousands of manufacturing jobs have left the country. Paper access to markets is not the same as real access, and we've given a lot away in terms of Canadian sovereignty in order to secure paper access to markets that has not necessarily resulted in real economic benefit for Canadians. That's got to be part of the debate. That's what we in the NDP are trying to make part of the debate on the TPP, and I would appreciate the member's support in doing that.
Questions and comments?